On the morning of November 18th, 1903, Jacob Hollis walked into the marshal's office in Bend, Oregon, wearing boots that had been repaired with strips of canvas sacking and a coat that no longer belonged to him. He was 29 years old. His hands, according to the deputy who took his statement, would not stop shaking. Marshal Peter Crowe asked him where the others were. Jacob looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "They're not coming back." That was all he would say about it. The expedition had left Bend 6 weeks earlier. 5 men hired to survey a timber tract in the Cascade foothills for the Portland and Eastern Lumber Company. It was routine work. The weather had been clear. They carried provisions for 8 weeks and had filed their route with the land office. Jacob Hollis was the youngest, hired on as camp assistant and packer. The others were experienced. Henry Drummond, the lead surveyor, his brother-in-law Thomas Vickers, a Norwegian logger named Axel Haugen, and a man named Dale Rucht, about whom little was known, except that he had worked the same mountains for a decade. When Jacob walked back into Bend alone, he weighed 30 pounds less than when he'd left. His feet were badly frostbitten. There was a deep laceration across his left forearm that had been sutured, crudely but competently, with what appeared to be fishing line. Marshal Crowe asked him what had happened to the others. Jacob stared at the floor. His jaw worked as though he were trying to speak. Finally, he shook his head. "I can't," he said. Crowe pressed him. Jacob only repeated the same phrase. "I can't. Not I don't know. Not I don't remember. I can't." Within 2 days, a search party was assembled. Jacob agreed to guide them as far as the base camp, but no farther. He led them through 40 miles of rough country without hesitation, retracing a route he had walked only once, in the opposite direction, alone. At the camp, a flat clearing near a fork in the Metolius River, they found the surveying equipment neatly stacked beneath a canvas tarp. The tents were struck. The fire pit was cold. There were no signs of struggle. There were also no bodies. The search party fanned out for 3 days. They found a set of boot prints leading west, away from the river into denser forest. The prints were overlapping, inconsistent in depth, suggesting the men had walked in single file, one behind the other. After half a mile, the trail vanished into a rockslide area where no tracks could hold. They found nothing else. Jacob was brought back to Bend and questioned again. This time, a representative from the lumber company was present, along with a lawyer hired by Henry Drummond's widow. Jacob sat in a wooden chair in the back room of the marshal's office and answered every question about the journey to the mountains. He described the weather, the terrain, the quality of the timber, the places they had camped. But when asked what had happened after they reached the survey site, he stopped talking. His hands gripped the edge of the chair. His breathing quickened. Marshal Crowe, who had seen men break under interrogation before, said later that Jacob looked like someone trying to hold a door shut against a flood. The lawyer leaned forward. "Mr. Hollis, 4 men are dead. Their families deserve to know." Jacob closed his eyes. "I can't tell you," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I can't. Can't or won't." Jacob opened his eyes. There was something in his expression that made the lawyer sit back. "It's the same thing," Jacob said. The questions did not stop. For weeks, Jacob was visited by relatives of the missing men, by journalists, by a private investigator hired by the lumber company to determine if negligence or foul play was involved. He allowed them into his rented room above the harness shop. He made them coffee. He listened to their questions with a kind of terrible patience, and he said nothing. His refusal was not hostile. It was not defiant. Those who spoke to him described it as something closer to grief, an immovable, exhausted kind of silence that seemed to cost him more than speaking would have. Henry Drummond's widow, Margaret, came to see him 3 times. On the 3rd visit, she brought her 2 daughters. They sat across from Jacob in his small room, the girls staring at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Margaret's voice was steady. "Please," she said, "just tell me if he suffered." Jacob looked at the girls. He looked at Margaret. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Margaret stood. She gathered her daughters and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back. "I don't know what you're protecting," she said quietly, "but I hope it's worth it." Jacob did not answer. In January of 1904, the county coroner issued a report concluding that Henry Drummond, Thomas Vickers, Axel Haugen, and Dale Rucht had died of exposure or accident in the Cascade Wilderness. The bodies were not recovered. The case was formally closed. Jacob Hollis was not charged with any crime. There was no evidence of wrongdoing. He had returned. They had not. That was all that could be proven. But the silence remained. People in Bend began to avoid him, not out of anger exactly, but unease. There was something in his refusal to speak that suggested knowledge, something he had seen or done or learned that could not be shared. And if it could not be shared, then perhaps it was better not to know. Jacob found work as a mill hand. He kept to himself. He attended church irregularly but never took communion. On Sundays, he could sometimes be seen walking alone along the river, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the ground. He never returned to the mountains, and he never spoke of what had happened there. In 1908, a geology student from the University of Oregon, conducting field research in the same region, claimed to have found a collapsed mine shaft approximately 12 miles west of the survey site. Inside, he reported seeing remnants of rope and what appeared to be fragments of clothing. He also noted unusual scratches on the rock walls, long, parallel gouges that he could not explain. The discovery was published in a regional journal. A copy was sent to Jacob Hollis. He burned it without reading it. By 1912, Jacob had married a schoolteacher named Ruth Calloway. They had a son. They lived quietly. Ruth knew that her husband had been part of the 1903 expedition. She knew that he had been the only one to return. She never asked him about it. Years later, after Jacob's death, Ruth would tell her granddaughter that she had asked him once, only once, whether he regretted not speaking. Jacob had been standing at the window looking out at the yard. He did not turn around. "Every day," he said. Ruth never asked again. Jacob Hollis died in 1951, at the age of 77. He left behind no written account, no confession, no explanation. The only record of his final words comes from his son, Daniel, who was with him in the hospital room when he died. According to Daniel, Jacob had been unconscious for hours. Then, just before the end, he opened his eyes. He looked at his son with an expression Daniel would later describe as relief, and he whispered, "They'll never know." Then he was gone. To understand the silence, one must first understand what was lost. The 5 men who left Bend in October of 1903 were not strangers to one another, though their relationships varied in depth and duration. Henry Drummond, at 42, was the eldest and the most established. He had been surveying timber tracts in Oregon for nearly 15 years and was known for his meticulous work and steady temperament. He was a Presbyterian, a husband, a father of 2. Those who knew him described him as a man who did not take risks. Thomas Vickers, 36, was Henry's brother-in-law, married to Henry's younger sister, Clara. He had worked alongside Henry for 5 years. He was quieter, less confident, but reliable. He had a habit of whistling while he worked, old hymns mostly that he had learned as a child in Pennsylvania. Axel Haugen was a Norwegian immigrant, 31 years old, who had come to Oregon in 1897. He spoke accented but fluent English and was valued for his strength and endurance. He had worked in the logging camps north of Bend and had a reputation for fairness. He sent money back to his family in Trondheim every month without fail. Dale Rucht was harder to reconstruct. He was somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s. Records conflict. He had no permanent address and no known family. He appeared in census records only sporadically, always listed as a laborer or packer. Those who worked with him said he was competent and uncommunicative. He drank alone. He did not start fights, but he did not avoid them either. And then there was Jacob Hollis, 29 years old, unmarried, the youngest son of a wheat farmer from the Willamette Valley who had died when Jacob was 16. Jacob had worked a series of temporary jobs, mill work, ranch hand, freight driver, before being hired by the Portland and Eastern Lumber Company as a camp assistant. It was his first surveying expedition. He had no wilderness experience beyond what he had learned on the job. The expedition was organized by the lumber company in response to a federal land grant that opened several thousand acres of Cascade forest for commercial harvest. Henry Drummond was contracted to survey the timber density, assess the terrain for logging roads, and provide a preliminary report. It was a straightforward assignment. The company expected the work to take 6 weeks. Henry selected his crew carefully. He wanted men he could trust. Thomas Vickers was an obvious choice, family, and familiar with Henry's methods. Axel Haugen had worked with Henry twice before and had proven himself dependable. Dale Rucht came recommended by another surveyor, though Henry later admitted to his wife that he had reservations. Something closed off about him, Henry had said, but Rucht knew the mountains, and that counted for more than personality. Jacob Hollis was hired on the recommendation of the company foreman, who described him as young but strong and willing. Henry met with Jacob once before the expedition. He asked him if he had ever been into the high country. Jacob said no. Henry nodded. "Then you'll listen to what you're told, and you won't wander off." Jacob agreed. They departed Bend on October 6, 1903, with 4 pack mules and provisions for 8 weeks. The weather was clear and cold. The first snow had not yet fallen. They followed a wagon road north for 2 days, then turned east into the foothills. The terrain grew steeper. The forest thickened. By the 4th day, they were beyond the reach of any established trail. Henry kept a detailed log, which was later recovered from the base camp. His entries from the first 2 weeks are routine and professional. He notes mileage, landmarks, and timber density. He records the condition of the men and the animals. There are no signs of conflict or distress. October 11th. Made 12 miles today. Timber quality excellent. Douglas fir, average diameter 30 inches. Vickers and Haugen worked well together, clearing brush for survey lines. Rucht remains distant but capable. Hollis learning quickly. October 15th. Reached the fork of the Metolius. Camp established. Weather holding. Expect a complete primary survey within 10 days. October 18th. Hollis asked if we had enough provisions to extend the survey farther west. I told him no. He did not press the question. That last entry is notable. It suggests that Jacob, even early in the expedition, was thinking about going farther, into areas that had not been planned. Why? According to testimony from a shopkeeper in Bend who had outfitted the expedition, Jacob had purchased a pocket journal and a box of pencils before leaving. The shopkeeper remembered this because Jacob had asked whether the pencils would write in cold weather. That journal was never found. The men developed routines. Henry and Thomas worked the survey lines during the day, using a compass and chain to map the timber tracts. Axel cleared brush and marked trees. Dale managed the mules and maintained the camp. Jacob assisted wherever he was needed, packing equipment, hauling water, preparing meals. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire. Henry read aloud from a copy of the Virginian that he had brought from home. Axel carved small wooden figures, animals mostly, and left them at the base of trees as a kind of informal marker. Thomas whistled. Dale drank from a flask and said little. Jacob listened. One evening, according to a later account Thomas Vickers had shared with his wife before the expedition, Henry asked the men what they planned to do with their pay when they returned. Thomas said he would buy Clara a new piano. Axel said he would send half to Norway and save the rest. Dale said nothing. Jacob hesitated. Then he said, "I'd like to see what's farther west." Henry laughed. "There's nothing farther west but more trees and fewer people." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's what I'd like to see." On October 21st, Henry's log records the first anomaly. Rucht reported finding an old campsite approximately 2 miles northwest of our position. Fire ring, remnants of canvas, no recent activity. He believes it may have been a trapper's camp, abandoned 5 or more years ago. I noted the location but saw no reason to investigate further. The notation is brief, almost dismissive, but it marks the first reference to something beyond the planned survey area, a suggestion that others had been in this region before and had left. Dale Rucht, who found the site, said nothing more about it, but Jacob asked questions. According to a fragment of conversation recorded in Thomas Vickers' letters to his wife, letters that were preserved by Clara after Thomas's death, Jacob wanted to know if Dale thought the camp had been abandoned voluntarily. Dale had looked at him for a long time before answering. "Does it matter?" he said. Jacob did not ask again. By the end of October, the primary survey was complete. The weather was holding, though the nights were growing colder. Henry made a decision. They would extend the survey an additional week, pushing farther west to assess timber tracts beyond the original boundary. The company would appreciate the extra data. The men agreed. Henry's final log entry is dated October 28, 1903. Extended survey begins tomorrow. Rucht will guide. Hollis and Haugen to assist. Vickers and I will complete final measurements at base camp and join them by week's end. Weather permitting, we should return to Bend by mid-November. The entry is routine. There is no indication of concern, but it marks the last time all 5 men were confirmed to be together. What happened next must be reconstructed from absence. On October 29th, Dale Rucht, Axel Haugen, and Jacob Hollis left the base camp at dawn. They carried minimal equipment, compass, axe, rope, provisions for 3 days, and planned to survey a ridge approximately 8 miles to the northwest. Henry Drummond and Thomas Vickers remained at the base camp to finalize the survey maps and prepare for the return journey. According to Henry's log, his final entry, the 3 men were expected back by October 31st. They did not return. The search party that later examined the base camp found Henry's logbook inside his tent, closed and stacked neatly atop his maps. There were no entries after October 28th. The camp itself was orderly. The fire had been extinguished properly. The tents were struck and secured. The surveying equipment was packed and covered. It suggested deliberate preparation, not panic, not flight. Henry and Thomas had left the camp, but they had left it carefully. The tracks leading west from the base camp were discovered on the 2nd day of the search. 5 sets of boot prints, overlapping, moving in single file. They followed a game trail into denser forest, then veered north toward a ridgeline. The prints were clear for nearly a mile before the terrain turned to loose shale and the trail disappeared. The search party followed the ridge as far as they could. They found no further tracks, no abandoned gear, no blood, no signs of struggle. One of the searchers, a man named Eli Thorne, who had prospected in the area for years, later told the marshal that the ridge led to bad country. When pressed to explain, he said the terrain was unstable, prone to rock slides, difficult to navigate even in daylight. Could they have gotten lost? The marshal asked. Eli shook his head. Not 5 men, not if they stayed together. What if they didn't stay together? Eli didn't answer that. Jacob Hollis, questioned repeatedly in the weeks following his return, confirmed that he had been part of the group that left the base camp on October 29th. He confirmed that Dale Rucht had been leading. He confirmed that the plan had been to survey the ridge and return within 2 days. When asked what happened after they reached the ridge, Jacob stopped talking. Marshal Crowe tried different approaches. He asked specific questions. Did they find the ridge? Did they survey it? Did something go wrong? Jacob stared at his hands. Crowe softened his tone. "We're not accusing you of anything, son. We just need to understand." Jacob's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "I can't make you understand." "Why not?" Jacob looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "Because I don't understand it myself." There was a theory, floated by the lumber company's investigator, that the men had encountered a rival logging operation, claimed jumpers or squatters who had been working the same timber illegally. A confrontation could have turned violent. Bodies could have been hidden. The theory collapsed almost immediately. No evidence of rival camps was found. No reports of squatters had been filed. And Jacob, when asked directly if they had encountered anyone else in the mountains, said no. "No one else?" the investigator pressed. "No," Jacob said. "Then what happened?" Jacob closed his eyes. "I can't." Another theory suggested an accident, a rock slide, a fall, something sudden and catastrophic that had killed 4 men and left Jacob to find his way back alone. But if it had been an accident, Why wouldn't Jacob say so? Margaret Drummond, Henry's widow, asked him this directly during one of her visits. If it was an accident, she said, you wouldn't be protecting anyone. You'd just be telling the truth. Jacob looked at her. His expression was impossible to read. Maybe that's the problem, he said quietly. What does that mean? Jacob did not answer. The last confirmed sighting of the 5 men together comes from a pair of hunters who passed through the region in late October. They were camped near a stream approximately 10 miles west of Bend when they saw a group of men moving through the trees in the distance. The hunters did not approach. They were not certain the men had seen them, and they had no reason to make contact. One of the hunters, a man named George Pruitt, later testified that the group had been walking quickly, like they had somewhere to be. Did they seem distressed? The marshal asked. Pruitt thought about it. More like determined. All of them? I couldn't see all their faces, but they were moving together. That's what I remember. They stayed close. The sighting was dated October 30th, the day before Henry and Thomas's expected return to base camp. It was the last time anyone saw them alive, except Jacob. What happened between October 30th and November 18th, when Jacob walked into the marshal's office, remains unknown. The distance from the ridge area to Bend is roughly 40 miles through difficult terrain. Even traveling quickly, it would have taken Jacob at least 4 days to make the journey alone. That leaves 2 weeks unaccounted for. Where was he? Why did it take so long? And why did he return alone? Jacob's physical condition upon his return offered some clues, but few answers. The frostbite on his feet suggested prolonged exposure to cold. The laceration on his arm suggested an injury, possibly from a fall, possibly from something else. The sutured wound indicated that someone had treated it. When the doctor in Bend examined Jacob, he asked who had stitched the wound. I did, Jacob said. With what? Fishing line. Where did you get fishing line? Jacob hesitated, then he said, We brought it. The doctor nodded. But later, he confessed to the marshal that he didn't believe Jacob. The stitching was too precise, too practiced for someone sewing his own arm under duress. Someone helped him, the doctor said. Who? The doctor shook his head. I don't know. There was one other detail that investigators returned to repeatedly. The coat. Jacob had been wearing a coat when he returned that did not belong to him. It was too large, worn, patched at the elbows. When asked where he had gotten it, Jacob said he didn't remember. The marshal pressed him. You don't remember putting on someone else's coat? Jacob looked at him. No. Whose coat was it? I don't know. Was it one of theirs? Jacob's face went pale. He shook his head, not in denial, but as if refusing to answer. I can't, he said. The separation of the group, whenever it occurred, however it occurred, was the hinge upon which everything else turned. If they had stayed together, perhaps all 5 would have returned. If they had separated by choice, perhaps only bad luck had killed the others. But if they had separated because of something Jacob saw, or did, or refused to do, then his silence began to make a different kind of sense. Years later, in 1921, a logger working near the Metolius River found a surveyor's compass buried in the roots of a fallen tree. The compass was engraved with Henry Drummond's initials. The tree had been dead for years. The compass had been there longer. The logger brought it to the land office in Bend. Someone suggested sending it to Jacob Hollis, who was still living in town. Jacob refused to accept it. The silence did not end with the close of the investigation. It grew. Jacob Hollis returned to ordinary life, but he carried the expedition with him like a weight he could not set down. In the years following 1903, he became known not for what he had survived, but for what he would not say. The refusal defined him. It shaped how people saw him, how they spoke to him, how they kept their distance. He was not shunned exactly, but he was marked. In the spring of 1904, Jacob took a job at a sawmill on the outskirts of Bend. The work was hard and repetitive, stacking lumber, operating saws, clearing waste. He was quiet, efficient, and kept apart from the other workers. During lunch breaks, while the men gathered to smoke and talk, Jacob sat alone near the edge of the mill yard, staring out toward the tree line. One of the mill workers, a man named Frank Delacroix, later recalled trying to befriend Jacob in those early months. "I figured he'd been through something rough," Frank said in an interview conducted in 1947, "and maybe he just needed someone to treat him normal." Frank invited Jacob to join a poker game. Jacob declined. Frank offered to buy him a drink. Jacob declined. Finally, Frank asked him outright, "What happened up there?" Jacob looked at him for a long moment. His face was expressionless. "You wouldn't believe me," he said. Frank laughed, trying to keep it light. "Try me." Jacob shook his head. "No." Frank never asked again. The pressure to speak came from all sides. The families of the missing men continued to visit Jacob throughout 1904 and into 1905. Margaret Drummond came more than once, sometimes with letters she had written to her husband, asking Jacob to read them aloud so that Henry might somehow hear. Jacob read them. He did not cry. He did not speak. Clara Vickers, Thomas's widow, came with a priest. The priest asked Jacob if he would confess what he knew, not to the law, but to God. The confession would be sealed, protected. No one else would hear. Jacob looked at the priest for a long time. "I can't confess what I don't understand," he said. "Then let me help you understand," the priest offered. Jacob stood and walked to the door. He opened it gently. "Thank you for coming," he said. The priest did not return. In the summer of 1905, a journalist from Portland traveled to Bend to write a feature story on the disappearance. The journalist, a young man named Arthur Lyle, tracked Jacob down and requested an interview. Jacob agreed. They met in Jacob's rented room. Arthur brought a notebook and a list of questions. He began with the basics: the route, the weather, the condition of the men. Jacob answered everything clearly and without hesitation, until Arthur asked what happened after they reached the ridge. Jacob stopped talking. Arthur waited. He tried a softer approach, asking if Jacob felt responsible. "Yes," Jacob said. "For what?" Jacob looked out the window. His jaw tightened. "For coming back." Arthur wrote it down. He asked another question, then another. Jacob did not respond. Finally, Arthur set down his notebook. "People think you're hiding something," he said. Jacob nodded. "I know. Are you?" Jacob met his eyes. "Yes." "Why?" Jacob did not blink. "Because it's the only kind thing I can do." Arthur published the interview in September of 1905. The final line became widely quoted in the region. Jacob Hollis refuses to speak not because he is guilty, but because he believes silence is a mercy. The article did not settle the matter. If anything, it deepened the mystery. By 1906, the public interest in the case had faded. The families had moved on, or had learned to live with the absence of answers. The missing men were presumed dead. No new evidence emerged, but Jacob remained. He changed jobs twice, moving from the sawmill to a freight company, then to a stable where he cared for horses. He attended church sporadically, always sitting in the back pew, always leaving before anyone could speak to him. He rented a small house at the edge of town, near the river. He lived alone. In 1908, the same year the geology student reported finding the collapsed mine shaft, a man appeared in Bend claiming to be Dale Rucht's brother. His name was Samuel Rucht. He was a miner from Idaho, thin and sunburned, with a scar running along his jaw. He had seen a newspaper article about the disappearance and had traveled to Oregon to find out what happened. Samuel went to Jacob's house unannounced. Jacob answered the door. The two men stood facing each other for a long moment. "You knew my brother," Samuel said. "Yes." "He's dead." "Yes." Samuel's face hardened. "Did you kill him?" Jacob did not flinch. "No." "Then what happened?" Jacob's hand tightened on the doorframe. He looked past Samuel, toward the mountains in the distance. "He made a choice," Jacob said quietly. "What choice?" Jacob shook his head. "I can't tell you." Samuel took a step forward. His voice shook. "He was my brother." Jacob looked at him. There was something raw in his expression. Grief or guilt or both. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry." Samuel stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away. He never came back. In the years that followed, Jacob Hollis slowly rebuilt a version of normalcy. He met Ruth Calloway in 1911. She was a school teacher, recently widowed, with a young daughter. They married in 1912. Jacob became a stepfather and later a father to their son, Daniel. Ruth knew about the expedition. Everyone in Bend knew. But she also knew instinctively that asking Jacob to speak about it would be a kind of cruelty. She loved him anyway. Her granddaughter, in an interview conducted in 1982, recalled Ruth saying, "Jacob carried something heavy. I never knew what it was. But I knew he didn't want to put it down, because if he did, someone else might pick it up." Jacob worked odd jobs throughout the 1910s and 1920s. He repaired fences. He drove wagons. He trained horses. He was known as reliable if remote. He did not drink. He did not socialize. He did not tell stories. But he was not unkind. Neighbors remembered him helping families in need, fixing a roof, delivering firewood, sitting with a sick child while the parents worked. He did these things quietly, without expectation of thanks. When asked why, he once said, "Because it's easier to help than to explain." In 1929, a writer named Evelyn March published a book titled Vanished: The Unsolved Mysteries of the American West. One chapter was devoted to the 1903 disappearance. Evelyn had interviewed several people in Bend, including Jacob. The interview was brief. Evelyn asked Jacob if he would ever write down what happened. Jacob said no. "Even for your family?" she asked. Jacob thought about it. Then he said, "Especially for my family." Evelyn pressed him. "Do you think people have a right to know?" Jacob looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I don't." The chapter ended with Evelyn's observation. Jacob Hollis is not a man haunted by memory. He is a man protecting others from it. Jacob's son, Daniel, grew up aware of his father's silence. He knew that his father had been part of an expedition. He knew that others had died, but he also knew not to ask. Once, when Daniel was 12, he found a newspaper clipping in a drawer, an article about the disappearance. He brought it to his father. Jacob looked at it for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the drawer. "Some things," he said, "are better left alone." Daniel never brought it up again. In 1943, during World War II, Daniel enlisted in the army. Before he left, Jacob pulled him aside. "If something happens to you," Jacob said, "and you come back and people ask you what it was like." He paused. His eyes were tired. "You don't owe them an answer." Daniel nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He would, later. Jacob Hollis died on March 14, 1951, in a hospital in Bend. He was 77 years old. He had been ill for several weeks, pneumonia, complicated by age. In his final hours, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Ruth sat beside him, holding his hand. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed. Jacob's breathing slowed. Then suddenly his eyes opened. He looked at Daniel with an expression of profound relief. He whispered, "They'll never know." Then he closed his eyes and was gone. After Jacob's death, Ruth and Daniel cleaned out his house. They found no journal, no letters, no written account. In the back of a closet wrapped in canvas, they found a small wooden carving, a bear, crudely made, weather-worn. Ruth recognized it immediately. Axel Haugen had been known for carving animals. She held it for a long time. Then she wrapped it back up and put it away. She never showed it to anyone. The historian who reconstructs this story does so with the awareness that it cannot be completed. The missing pieces are not lost. They were deliberately withheld. Jacob Hollis returned from the mountains in November of 1903. 4 men did not. And in the 48 years between his return and his death, Jacob Hollis never explained why. This is not a failure of memory. It is not a failure of will. It is a choice. The question then is not what happened, but why Jacob chose silence. There are several possibilities, none of them fully satisfying. The first is guilt. Jacob may have survived through an action that led, directly or indirectly, to the deaths of the others. Perhaps a decision he made, to take a certain path, to attempt a dangerous crossing, resulted in catastrophe. Perhaps he feels responsible, and his silence is a form of self-punishment. But this does not explain his consistency. Guilt often leads to confession, or at least to the desire for absolution. Jacob refused both. The second possibility is shame. Jacob may have witnessed something, cowardice, betrayal, violence, that implicated one or more of the men in a way that would dishonor their memory. To speak would be to tarnish the dead. To remain silent is to protect them. This is plausible, but it does not account for Jacob's insistence that he could not speak, rather than that he would not. The language suggests something beyond discretion, something closer to inability. The third possibility is trauma. Jacob may have experienced something so overwhelming, so incomprehensible, that he lacks the language to describe it. Not because it was supernatural, there is no evidence of that, but because it exceeded the framework of his understanding. Perhaps the men encountered a situation that revealed something about themselves or about each other that could not be reconciled with ordinary life. Perhaps they faced a choice that stripped away the veneer of civilization and left them raw. And perhaps Jacob, having seen what people become when everything else is stripped away, chose to protect the living by refusing to describe it. The fourth possibility is simpler, and perhaps the most profound. Jacob's silence was not evasion. It was mercy. He understood that some truths do more harm than good, that some knowledge, once shared, cannot be unlearned, that the families of the missing men, already grieving, would gain nothing from knowing the details of how their loved ones died, or what they did, or who they became in their final days. Jacob carried the burden so that others would not have to. There is a phrase that appears in several of the interviews conducted with people who knew Jacob. He looked like a man holding a door shut. It is an apt metaphor. Jacob spent his life standing between the past and the present, ensuring that what happened in the mountains stayed there. He did not do this out of cowardice. He did it out of conviction. He believed that silence could be an act of love. The historian, reviewing the evidence, notes the absence of resolution. There are no bodies, no definitive cause of death, no clear narrative arc. But the absence is not a flaw. It is the point. Jacob Hollis did not owe the world an explanation. He did not owe the family's closure. He did not owe history a tidy ending. He returned. He lived. He loved his family. He helped his neighbors. And he carried the weight of the mountains alone until the day he died. That is enough. In 1973, a fire swept through the Bend courthouse and destroyed many of the older records, including the original case files from the 1903 disappearance. What remains are fragments, interview transcripts, newspaper clippings, Henry Drummond's logbook. The mountains, meanwhile, have kept their silence. Several expeditions have returned to the area over the decades, searching for remains or artifacts. A few items have been found: a rusted surveying chain, a fragment of canvas, a boot sole, but no bodies, no answers. The forest has reclaimed what was left behind. In 1998, a filmmaker attempted to produce a documentary about the disappearance. She interviewed descendants of the missing men, reviewed historical records, and hiked the original route. She also tried to locate descendants of Jacob Hollis. Jacob's grandson, Daniel's son, declined to participate. "My grandfather made a choice," he said. "I'm not going to undo it." The documentary was never completed. The final piece of evidence is a photograph, taken in 1920, that hangs in the Deschutes County Historical Society. It shows a group of men standing in front of a sawmill. Jacob Hollis is among them, standing at the edge of the group, his hands in his pockets. He's not smiling, but he's not frowning either. He looks tired, but not broken. What is striking about the photograph is not Jacob, but the man standing next to him, a co-worker presumably, who has turned slightly to look at Jacob. The co-worker's expression is difficult to read. It might be curiosity. It might be concern. Jacob is not looking at the co-worker. He is looking past the camera, toward something in the distance. The mountains. The historian closes the file. The story is incomplete, and will remain so. That is not a failure. It is a testament to Jacob Hollis's will. He returned from the mountains with a secret. He carried it for 48 years, and when he died, he took it with him. The silence is the only certainty. In the end, the historian is left with a question that cannot be answered. What did Jacob Hollis see in the mountains that was so terrible or so sacred that he chose to protect the world from it for the rest of his life? We will never know. And perhaps, that is exactly as it should be.